Give me just a second for it to upload the streaming. Give me just a second for it to upload the streaming. So Mary, your video is on. You're the only one with a video on.
But you can't see me, can you?
No, I just see your window.
Okay. Is that okay?
That's fine. That's fine. All right. Is everybody else good? You're all on mute except Carolyn. Hey, Carolyn. Tyler. Good morning. So did you hear my announcement about the video?
Yes,
Okay.
I did. I just wanted to say hi. I'm going to shut it back off.
All right. Hey, Tyler. Thank you. Okay, let's get started. Cultural competency. I'm going to share my screen. We're a small group, and so the plan is to give you 6 hours of information in way less than 6 hours. And you still get a 6-hour certificate. So I know we won't go to 4:30, but we're just gonna work through this information. Some of this information may be familiar to you because some of it is from an ethics standpoint. And so I've shared some of it before. And, you know, okay. I'm not sure where I'm recording now. I'm confused. But anyway, cultural competency and boundary adherence and burnout when working with substance use disorder clients for adult and adolescents. And so let's jump in here and take a look at some things. Just kind of want to know, what is it about this training? Did you take this training because you absolutely need this topic? Or was it something about it that interests you in regards to your job? Patrick, why don't you chime in on that for me? Patrick, can you hear me? Anybody? Okay.
Yes, I can hear you. I hear you.
So did you hear my question? What motivated you to take this training?
Oh, I need to refresh myself on cultural competency and how to relate with other cultures, the do's and the don'ts.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment on why you chose to take the cultural competency training?
I think taking a cultural competency training is always important if you're working with clients, regardless of who they are, because it's always important. I mean, a lot of people identify with cultures and ethnicities that may not be visually present for us. And so it's important for us to always have the knowledge, if not refreshed, in the back of our head. So that's part of the reason I took it.
Okay. Okay. And I think that it's fair to say that we can't fully know another culture, but this training is designed to help us not so much with a particular culture, but to know the importance of competency and to know what competency actually is, what is required of us to be competent. Anybody else?
I'm a substance abuse counselor, and we have a large Marshallese population and a Hispanic population to work with, and it kind of helps me look at different ways I can connect with them.
Okay.
I'm also a substance abuse counselor.
Okay. All right, thank Tessie. So cultural competence. In module 1, we'll discuss clinicians and cultural competence. When we talk about cultural competence, it's more than a discrete skill set or knowledge base. It requires self-evaluation on the part of the practitioner, on our part. And culturally competent counselors are aware of their own culture and values and the impact their culture and values have on the therapeutic process. And so we have to realize that we have our own assumptions and we have our own biases about other cultures. We want to strive to understand how these assumptions affect our ability to provide culturally responsive services to clients from similar or diverse cultures. And sometimes our own assumptions and biases about our culture is different from others in our own culture. And so we can't assume that because that's how we perceive our culture, that's how the rest of the people in our culture see it. And so we begin the process of becoming culturally competent by uncovering the following views that shape our perception when we think about the counseling process. Identifying and exploring cultural heritage, our personal perspective and worldview, and our clinical views, because all of that plays a part in shaping our perception in our counseling process. So when we think about cultural competency as professionals, we need to possess a general understanding of the cultures of the specific clients with whom we work. So, that being said, if I work with predominantly African-American culture, even though I am African-American, it does not mean that my view of the African-American culture is the way my clients view it. Because so many factors, so many things are factored into our views. If I work with a predominantly Hispanic culture, I need to study and take some time to dive into their culture. Individual cultural differences affect substance abuse, health beliefs, help-seeking behavior, and perceptions of behavioral health services. Some cultures see seeking help as from a shame base, and some don't. And so culturally competent counselors frame issues in culturally relevant ways, make allowances for variations in the use of personal space, and are respectful of culturally specific meanings of touch, hugging, hand holding, whatever type of touch that might be. We explore culturally based experiences of power and powerlessness. When we talk about the 12 steps, and the major concept of the 12 steps is admitting powerlessness. That may be very difficult for some cultures. And so we want to take that into consideration. Adjust communication styles to the client's culture. Interpret emotional expressions in light of the client's culture, and expand roles and practices as needed. So we expand roles and practices as needed. We lead from behind and allow the client to be the expert, so that in essence, they educate us about the culture. They educate us about their culture. They help us to see how they see their culture.
Mhm.
So let's take a look at a video.
How far you go in life depends on you being tender with the young, compassionate with the aged, sympathetic with the striving, and tolerant of the weak and the strong. Because someday in life, you will have been all of these.
I chose this video because of the very last statement when he said, at some point in life, assuming we live a full life, we will have been all of those, young, old, weak, in need. And so when working in this field, oftentimes we are at risk of burnout. And because we are at risk of burnout, we need to take time to take care of ourselves so that we can be caring, we can be kind, we can be compassionate, and we don't begin to see our clients as just another number. Any comments on the video? It was quick, but it made some really good points.
I think that for me, it kind of, excuse me, like the high risk pregnancy. Those are things that I'll be working with, and to remember that that's something to be aware of regardless of the age of the population.
Mhm.
So that's kind of one of the things I hadn't really put in maybe the cultural competent category as opposed to just being aware. So that was something that reminded me to think kind of more whole person as opposed to my specific area.
Okay, that's good.
If that made sense. It sounded right in my head, but I don't know if it came out the way I wanted it to.
No, that's good, because we don't always think of specific areas that people go through that are maybe temporary situations, but nevertheless, though they are temporary situations, they're sensitive times. And like you said, problem pregnancies, pregnancy period, and the lady with the migraines, different times in a person's life, and it may not be something we can identify with or relate to, but they require patience and compassion and understanding from our perspective. We may not feel like it's that serious of an issue, but from their perspective, it is. Patrick. Patrick, I see your hand is up. If you're talking, you gotta unmute yourself.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I can identify with the video. As you said, I like the way that it went through each stage, and if we live long enough, we will go through those processes as well. And looking at the chart you had where it says expand roles and practices as needed. The other day I had a client, and I've heard this term used before, but I just assumed that I knew what it meant. I work with the opiate population, and clients often would tell me they have been chipping, and I just assumed, I was assuming wrong. So I like where you say you have to expand your rotors, practices as needed, and lead from behind. I had to ask the client, I just, had to take off my embarrassment and shame or whatever I was in or feeling and find out exactly what they were talking about because I'm the expert don't mean I know everything. And so when they explained to me what chipping meant, I really appreciate it. But sometimes we can get so caught up to I'm the professional, I'm this, I'm supposed to know everything, but we don't.
Yeah,
It's like learning every day from this population, and it's a very interesting population. And I enjoy it actually, because I used to work with a different population, MDOC clients. So yeah, this is different for me, and I'm learning every day about the opiate heroin population. It really, I thought I knew it, but I really didn't. It's really something totally different animal when it relates to marijuana use, cocaine use, and heroin use. It's just so different, and so I really
yes.
like.
And the client, okay, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, the client is the expert, right? And I worked with adolescents for a little over 10 years, adolescents in the juvenile detention facility, right? And so being, when I started, I was in my 50s. When my time with them ended, I was in my 60s. Actually, I just stopped working with them when COVID hit. And I got an education. Let me tell you, those young people, I gave them the floor to talk to me and teach me because I've been in recovery for 30 years. And so there's so much that has changed, and so much about the drug culture that's different. And from an adolescent standpoint, from when I was an adolescent and drugs were on the street to their experience with drugs as adolescents. I mean, it was just mind blowing. Some of the concepts, some of the language that they used. And then what was really funny, especially to them, is that some of their language lingo was repetitive from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And so, yeah, the client will educate us. So what is culture? When we talk about culture, integrated patterns of human behavior that include language, thoughts, communication, actions, customs, beliefs, values of racial, ethnic, religious, and or social groups. So remember that, not remember it, but remember that it's on this slide, because you will see that again on the post-test, I do believe. Racial culture is associated with biology. Races are genetically distinct populations within the same species. Ethnic culture. An ethnic group is a group of people who have something in common because they or their ancestors came from a particular geographical area. Usually they are united by a language as well as by other cultural traditions. And so when we think about other cultural traditions, the way that they dress, the food that they eat, different particular foods that they that are a highlight for them. Some other cultural practices may be, how many of you work with a population that like to feed you? They like to bring you cookies, or they like to bring you, they like to give gifts to you. Anybody?
I do.
And can that present a problem though?
Yes.
Mhm.
Have to tell them don't do it.
Yeah, yeah. And you don't want to hurt their feelings, right? But you want to keep your job, and you want to, live by the policies and procedures of the agency as well, you know, but those sometimes because it's a tradition for them, we have to kind of sit them down and have a heart to heart, you know, about why we can't accept the gifts. But
And with this, with this individual, it's a way of expressing that they appreciate me. It's an older woman from that generation. Maybe that's what they did when they really enjoyed a personal appreciation. They wanted to give them something to show them, hey, because you're like, oh, I'm making greens. I'm bringing some greens. No, don't bring me any greens.
you know, so yeah, that could be a cultural, you know, culturally. And so when we talk about culture, we're talking about racial, ethnicity, religious culture. This is a culture, cultural practice common to a particular religion. So, well, you know, you may have Catholics, you may have Christians, you may have Catholics who consider themselves Christians, you may have Buddhists, you may have, you know, just so many different religions, and they have common practices. I worked for an agency treatment facility as a director, and it was predominantly African American clients. And then the second dominant ethnicity was or race was Caucasian. And then we had just a small number of Arabic. And so we had not had Arabic clients before the first one came. And she had practices that we had not made accommodations for. In the middle of the day of group and individual sessions, she needed to be able to take time to pray in her own way in privacy. And so we had to accommodate her. And that's where we expanded our roles and practices as needed. Then we have social culture. Sociocultural factors include education, income, health. And when we talk about health, we can go back to, I think it was you, Tassie, that talked about the, problem pregnancy, or even in the video, they talked about, migraine headaches. We want to be sensitive to the health of our clients that might cause them to have to be dealt with different than a person that does not have that health issue. Technology is a whole culture in and of itself. It can feel I know for me, just dealing with young people, my family even, it's a whole nother culture when it comes to technology. And I remember initially feeling offended almost at how engrossed this younger generation is in technology, to the point that you barely can get a face-to-face one-on-one interaction from them, or even a phone call versus a text. And so how many of you all have experienced that with your clients in terms of the technology culture? Tassie, your hand is raised.
I have actually, I work with ages from, 13 to 70. And I found that in some of the, I don't know how to say this politely, in some of the older generation, things like email, text messages, those kind of things, people who are re-entering from incarceration, who've been there for quite a while and are not used to the technology, are not used to, smartphones. Smartphones have been one of the biggest things that I have come to have to help with. And those are usually within the first times that you start working with them. so that they can kind of understand how the technology works and how text messages and emails work and things like that. So the older generation and a lot of people who are criminal justice involved and have been incarcerated for a period of time are generally the people that struggle with some of that technology culture for me.
Mhm. And you know what? That's a really good point. That is a really good point, because so much can change in 10 years. You know, in the last 10 years, so much has changed that, but I think about those people, the clients who came out after cell phones were introduced to society, you know, and they did not have a clue about this phone that you carry around with you. When they went in, all there was only pagers, you know, beepers, pagers, and then they came out to cell phones. So it's quite an adjustment, and we take some things for granted as people who have, or we can, not necessarily we do, but we can take some things for granted. Because we evolved with the technology. The drug culture is a culture all in and of itself. And our clients, I know the gang culture, the drug culture and the gang culture is really something that has to be paid close attention to in the juvenile justice system, because there are drug wars and gang wars. And when we have the adolescents incarcerated together, oftentimes we experience fighting breaking out and not realizing why they're fighting, but it's something that started on the street, and it has to do with the drug culture. And so we want to pay attention to the drug culture and to understand what, as Patrick talked about, the chipping, you know, understand what the language of the drug culture is, so that we as clinicians won't miss something that's being spoken of and being revealed right up under our nose, but we don't know what the language is, so we don't realize what's taking place right there, perhaps within the treatment or recovery culture. And that's another culture. And when one comes in from the drug culture into the treatment and recovery culture, there can be they can have a difficult time with making that shift into the new culture. So what is cultural competence in clinical practice? It's a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies that come together in a system, agency, or among professionals and enable the system, agency, or professionals to work effectively across cultural situations. So 4 components of a cultural competence, is number 1, awareness of our own cultural worldview. How do you as an individual view culture worldwide? Like, what is your attitude towards, and that's number 2, what is your attitude towards cultural differences? You know, I can remember being insensitive, culturally insensitive, and really feeling very stern about when dealing with clients who were having a hard time adjusting to substance abuse, the substance abuse treatment culture, you know, realizing that you need this, you know, and you should be grateful that you have this opportunity, so get it together, you know, and not realizing that there was a shift that needed to take place, and that patience was needed to help them, and education was needed to help them to adjust to the new culture. Number 3, knowledge and awareness of different cultural practices. When we talk about knowledge and awareness of different cultural practices, beliefs, and worldviews, you know, our beliefs are developed as a result of several things: the era that we grew up in, and how in that era certain cultures were highlighted and looked at from a certain perspective, how the world views a culture. And I think that in this season of that we're living in, even with police brutality and being as prevalent and open as it is, that there's a view, a cultural view that's changing, and we need to be sensitive to the change. For instance, when I was an adolescent and a young adult, we weren't afraid of the police because that had not been my experience. And so as a 64-year-old now, dealing with a younger generation who they're experiencing this new worldview or this cultural view of that system, I have to be sensitive to what's going on in the world to renew my thinking concerning some things and not staying stuck on how it was. Because, we hear people and maybe even say it ourselves sometimes, that never would have happened when I was a kid because my mama wouldn't have had it. My mama wouldn't put, and I hear people say that. And then I think, if what was done throughout my generation was so perfect, the outcome of my life and many others like me may have been a little different. So let's not stay stuck on how it was and my belief that developed in being necessarily the right way of seeing things, because some of my own beliefs could be faulty. And so being aware of my own cultural beliefs is important as well. And then number 4, possessing cross-cultural skills. That's what the components that go into a culturally competent clinician or clinical practice. When we talk about possessing cross-cultural skills, learning new patterns of behaviors pertaining to the client's culture and their presenting problem. As a young person growing up, we only knew one family that lived in what could have been framed as foster care, but it was actually they were placed with family because their parents were deceased. But in this culture, we have to realize that part of the presenting problem for many of our clients may very well be that they've been a part of the foster care system for generations. So I would even, for years, going from foster care home to foster care home. So I would even venture to say that the foster care system is a cultural, it too is a culture in and of itself. And we have to look at that as being part of the presenting problem along with the substance abuse, or at least an underlying factor. Some of the characteristics of cultural competence, a developmental process that evolves over an extended period. So we are always evolving into a greater level, or should be always evolving into a greater level of cultural competence over extended periods of time. We're evolving, we're adjusting with the changes in the times, in generations. Also, another characteristic, understanding and communication ability to effectively interact with people from different backgrounds. And so we saw in the video that there was an interpreter, and they were interpreting a language, a foreign language. But sometimes we may need someone, if I'm working in an agency and I'm working with, let's say I'm working with Tassie, and she has a greater insight into a particular culture or even age group than I do. I might need her as an interpreter to help me interpret and get a better understanding of what my client's background is dictating, so that I can be a better clinician for my client, because I can't just be a clinician, I have to be my client's clinician. The consistent demonstration of acceptance and respect for culture in policy structures, practices, and attitudes. That's another characteristic of cultural competence. And then both individuals and organizations, when we talk about individuals, we must also realize that individuals make up the organizations. And so both individuals and organizations are at various levels of awareness, knowledge, and skills along the cultural competence continuum. So we're going to take a look at the continuum. We as clinicians want to desire and seek cultural encounters. And Patrick, you touched on that the encounter that you had, and I like the way you put that, that you had to put aside any feelings that you may have felt concerning not knowing what this meant, and maybe feeling like as a clinician you should know, but it's not necessary that we know, because we realize that in the world, in the street, in the drug culture, and in various cultures in general, things are constantly evolving and changing. And so we want to give ourselves as professionals permission to change and grow with and evolve with the changes that are taking place. And so we want to seek cultural encounters as opposed to shrinking back from having to dive into areas that we're not comfortable with, or that we don't have the insight and understanding. Because I tell you, working in this field, it has been a constant education for me. And so we want to see it as opportunities to directly interact with those from culturally diverse backgrounds. Patrick, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I liked when you said that you're not just a clinician, you are the client's clinician. And I definitely identify with that, because in that situation that I had described earlier, and also in some other situations, when I was working with other populations, I had to be able to identify with what they were saying. We're all speaking English, but yet I'm not understanding what they're trying to communicate to me.
Yeah.
And I know oftentimes, this might be funny, but a lot of times, and I like all types of music, but I would immerse myself in rap music so I could understand some of the drug language or some of the language they were using, so I could relate to my clients. Because if we're not relatable, I can't help them. Even though I might have the skill set to do it, I don't have the tools to do it. So I definitely agree with that.
And that's got to be hard. I don't know. For me, it is. Rap music is just very difficult for me. For my mind, I have such a hard time wrapping my mind around it, because it's like I can't hear. My ears are not in tune to what they're saying. But having younger people to help me and break it down is helpful as well. I'm sure that some of the music that emerged in my younger years, my grandmother. Now, my mother and I basically listened to the same music, because my mother was very young when I was born. So when I was 15, my mother was 30. So we didn't clash where music was concerned. Whatever new came out, we both liked it. But I'm sure my grandmother was challenged with some of the music that I listened to, and so it's to be expected. But as professionals, it's our responsibility to dive into those cultures and take it as an opportunity to get in touch with different cultural backgrounds. So we're going to look at the competence continuum momentarily. Why is cultural competence important for the organization. To reflect the multiracial and multi-ethnic heritages and cultural groups of its client base and community. I want to ask Carolyn. Carolyn, are you there?
Carolyn, which one?
Carolyn Watts Black.
Yeah, I'm here.
Listen, I know you've worked in the field for many years and in different areas. So can you just kind of comment on some of the challenges that you may have experienced in working with various multi-ethnic or multiracial cultural
Working-
groups?
Working with, say that again, I'm sorry, what did you say?
So when you think about the different organizations you worked for across various cultures, can you think of some of the challenges that you may have been faced with?
Working with different cultures, you're saying?
Yeah, either racial or ethnic cultures.
Okay, well, I think the most challenges is when you're working with different races or different cultures, things like that, is understanding, because when you go in, you think you have to understand that we don't know different cultures. We don't understand. So you have to learn to understand. So what, if you go in and if you only work with just one culture, one race, and then when someone else come in and you only have, say, if you only work with African American, and then say a Native American comes in,
Yeah,
and they're
absolutely.
totally different. It's what people don't. We only go in and we see what we see on TV, and and sometimes people in that group will often identify with what they see on TV, where you see what they see, what has been portrayed on TV, and they want that Native American person to be that. And they don't understand that Native Americans do not just sit around. They are not lazy. They are not, or the Hispanics are not lazy,
So we look at
all of
some
that. So
stereotypes.
you have problems there.
Yeah,
Yeah, they're
yeah,
looking at that. And they don't understand that Native Americans do not like to sit around in groups. They don't like groups. So that's what I faced a lot when you're dealing with, places like that. Or I think if, because I haven't done it in a long time, but I think the Hispanic, they're touchy, touchy, touchy. And, they like to hug, and they don't like, and African Americans say, don't touch me, don't touch me, so all those, you're facing all of that.
yeah. So
So you have to understand the culture and how to, so those are the things that I face when you're moving around, So you have to learn to understand and talk to. So you kind of have to sometimes break groups up to different spaces.
Yeah.
So sometimes you have a group within a group.
yeah. And that's what I was going to say. So based on what you're saying, there is even a need, in order to have a culturally competent organization, there would be a need to educate the clients about each other's culture.
Right. You have to educate the client about each other's culture to have them to understand each other's culture. But the same thing happens with African Americans. A long time ago, in my generation, they would say, "Oh, all you guys know about is the church," but that's my generation.
Yeah.
See, the culture now is not so much as we do go to church, but people in the nowadays generation, it's not like that anymore.
Yeah.
We go to church, but today's generation is not, they don't go to church for the pastor to pray and all of that. That's my generation.
Yeah.
But you have that culture now that don't do that. And that's not what they say, but people are saying that you go to church so your pastor can pray. So you have that culture that has totally changed.
Yeah. So we're
But
talking
that's
about
another thing.
understanding the religious culture. Understanding the religious
Right.
culture and the
But you
different
have,
religions.
but you have some therapists. right. But you still have some therapists today, and I have pulled them aside and say, don't say that, but you have to meet, just like a therapist nowadays sometimes have to meet the client where they are. Don't
And I think that's an emerging concept too, guys, that, you know, to become the client's therapist and not just a therapist with a
Right.
set mind, a set mindset or perspective on how I'm going to do therapy, but to be client centered
Right.
is also a part of being culturally competent. Thank you for sharing that, Carolyn. So we look at why cultural competence is important for the organization to reflect the multiracial and multi-ethnic heritages and cultural groups, client base and community. So that if the predominant culture of my agency is Hispanic, then the surroundings within my agency may even have some decor that lends to that culture, but not just that culture, so that we would make the paintings on the wall. You know what, my first training that I did in Iowa, I did a training in Iowa because initially it came about as a result of me needing to go to Iowa because that's where my son now lives. And so some years ago, after he had moved to Iowa, I had, wanted to visit, and I thought, well, I'll make this a business trip. And I didn't know anything about Iowa. And so my son's boss at that time was a community activist in the African American area where there was a heavy African American population, and they offered to let me use their facility for my training. And so I, kind of blindly went into this, had some conversations with them, good people, But when I got there, here's what happened. If you know anything about Iowa, I'm not sure if I have anyone from Iowa here today. Is there anyone on here from Iowa?
I am Nicole.
Oh, okay, good.
I'm in Dubuque.
I'm in Cedar Rapids.
Okay, Cedar Rapids, and yep, I've done some training there. I've been training in Iowa now for about 15 years. But when I first went, I didn't know anything. Like, I'm walking into a state that I am not familiar with. So they offered, to let me use their facility. And so I thought that was great. Well, I got there, and all of the decor, it was really a really nice community center, but all of the decor was African American. I mean, it was specifically for African Americans, and it was a community center that had after school activity. It was, really lending to the child from the single parent home who needed a place, and I didn't think anything of it. I'm African American, so I thought this is beautiful. But the majority of the people who came, and it was a nice size training, and the majority of the people who attended were not African American. And in my reviews, the participant evaluation, there were some complaints that it was not an atmosphere conducive to all cultures. And so I said that to say, now theirs was built around the community that they served. It was not a place that I needed to have various cultures come for training, but it may have worked for them. But what happens when that ethnical the ethnicity begins to shift in that community, where there are more Caucasians moving in to that area, and they need a community center as well. It would not fit. It would not be culturally competent for them. So That's one of the things that we look at. To meet funding, state licensing and or national accreditation requirements is another reason to be culturally competent. That's something that they look for. Also for risk management, the process of making and implementing decisions that will optimize therapeutic outcomes and minimize adverse effects upon clients and ultimately the organization through the increase of access to care. So when we talk about risk management, we're talking about the process of making and implementing decisions that will increase the access to care, that will improve assessment, treatment planning, and placement, that will enhance effective communication between clients and treatment providers, and also to increase understanding, the ability to understand the client's presenting problems, and then to decrease misunderstanding, to increase the understanding, to decrease misunderstanding of the client's presenting problem, and to decrease misunderstanding of the needs of clients with regard to appropriate referrals for evaluation or treatment. And so being culturally competent as an organization will give all of this, will give us a better insight and understanding. And as a competent organization coming in as a worker, as a new hire, an employee, the agency or the organization that's culturally competent will begin to educate the new hire, and may even in interviewing the new hire, look for some cultural competence that will help them fit into this culturally competent organization. I think the key to being interviewed might be being open and, expressing that you're open to evolving into the culture that's represented within the organization. So why is cultural competence? We're going to take a break after this slide. Well, why don't we stop here? We'll take a break here. Let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll pick up here. When you sign back in, when you come back from the break, please sign in the chat.